Well, hello, everyone. As Drew said, my name is Tim. I'm part of the team here. We live in a little village not too far from here, and across the road from us, there's this lovely green area. There's a pond, there's trees, there's swings, there are dogs running around, there's football on a Sunday morning, and I occasionally drive out of the house on a Sunday as I head towards Beacon Church and think, oh, maybe I should just go there instead. I don't know if some of you feel the same. I work a relatively busy job in London. I've got 4 kids, an often busy Saturday. Our local rugby club has a great Sunday morning program. And as my alarm hits, sometimes I think, I could really just do with hitting snooze, because sometimes church feels quite an effort. It feels quite tiring. And I combine that with thoughts that I occasionally have about some of the church's checkered history. And every now and again, I think, church, why should I bother? I could stay in bed. I could go to the shops. I could have breakfast with my wife, I could get ahead of emails, I could watch the sermon online, and maybe I would be just as happy. You might not share the sentiment. After all, you are here, and it's a Sunday morning, but you might be thinking, is it really worth it? You might be looking back on all the serving that you've done so wonderfully over the last 2 years and think, did it really make a difference? You might have been here for many decades and occasionally be asking that question. Well, today is our final talk in a series of talks about the church. We called it Christ's Bride, which is one of the descriptions that the early men and women who followed Jesus used to describe the church. And they said that Jesus was not just bothered about the church, but that he loved her so much that he died for her. And my hope in the next 25 minutes is that as we read from the Bible and as I share some of my stories, for all of us, why should I bother might become a little bit more, how can I not? How can I and my family not be part of this wonderful thing that God is doing? And if you're feeling a little bit, why can I bother, that you might be encouraged and invited back into the church, and that all of us might be encouraged in the work that we might be doing for many decades and be doing for many years to come. We've heard from lots of different people in recent weeks. We've had a great series. I echo much of what has been said. We've talked about church as community, church as family. We've talked about following in the example of Jesus' earliest followers. As Drew just said, my wife and I have really benefited from church as family over the last couple of weeks. This is the house that Drew mentioned, or the house with the tree and the electric wire in front of it. We slept on several people's couches, thanks to those. They know who they are. And I thought, maybe this morning I should scrap what I'm going to say and just talk about how blessed Rachel and I have felt over the last couple of weeks to be part of a wonderful church family. But I decided instead that I wanted to speak about the church from an angle that we haven't spoken about her yet in this series. I want to speak about the church not as she is now, but I want to speak about the church as she will one day be. Some of you will have read the Bible from cover to cover. It is a long but super interesting book. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it starts with an uncreated mind that we call God, who brings order out of nothing, who creates life and beauty and peace. And he creates humans. They fall away, though, and even the best of us, even the greatest humans, cannot can't recreate what God had originally made. And despite the fact that for thousands of years, God's promised, I'm going to send one to remake the world, to bring back into order everything as I intended it to be. It's sometimes hard to see how that will happen. And then after centuries of silence, Jesus is born. He resists temptation in a way that his ancestors couldn't. He follows God's instructions in a way that they couldn't. He says boldly that God's kingdom is coming now. He says now is the moment. It's going to be unlike anything that you can imagine. He says the first shall be last. He says the poor in spirit will be blessed. He says the humble will inherit the earth. He says true leadership, true greatness is when you serve others. And he shows that ultimately when he dies. He takes upon himself on the cross the consequences of every wrong thing that's been done. He gives each of us an opportunity in doing so to know peace with God, our Maker, and to be part of the church. The New Testament church, though, struggle at times. They're persecuted, but they also find it difficult to follow Jesus. And so we have these letters that make up the second half of the Bible when they're writing to each other. And then we get to the very final book of the Bible. It's a book called Revelation. It's maybe one of the most confusing books of the Bible. It's extremely poetic. It's got lots of dreams and visions in it. And right at the end of this final book of the Bible, there's this vision of what's going to happen in the future. If you've been in church for a while, you might be familiar with it. It's a new heaven and a new earth. John says it's a place where God is dwelling again with his people, where God wipes away every tear, where there's no more death, where there's no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. The old order of things has passed. The one who is seated on the throne, God says, behold, I am making everything new. It's a wonderful vision of what's to come. And in weeks like this, it's something wonderful to be able to hold on to. But actually, that's not quite the end of the story. Because after, 5,000 years of Bible history, right from the start through all the prophets and these great figures in the Old Testament to Jesus, to the church, to Revelation 21 that we've just spoken about, there's one more bit to come. The Bible finishes with a picture of the church as she one day will be. This is our passage for this morning. We're going to be in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 9. I'm going to read this passage to you. It's a relatively long passage and it is quite poetic, as I said, but stick with us. And I'm going to explain this passage this morning. So Revelation chapter 21 and verse 9. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who had talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured the city with a rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length and as wide and high as it is long. The angel measured the wall using human measurement, and it was 144 cubits thick. The wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. The foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th turquoise, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each gate made of a single pearl. The great street of the city was gold, as pure as transparent glass. I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. When I was at school, I had 2 subjects that I really didn't enjoy. One of them was geography. I mean, who wants to learn about clouds when you can learn about numbers, right? But probably even worse than geography was English poetry, and especially medieval English poetry. To be or not to be, that is the question, which sounds quite impressive to me, and I've heard it 1,000 times, but I'm still not quite sure what that question is that I'm being asked. I don't know if anyone can inform me. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles. Again, it sounds really good, but personally, I'm 3 words into this, and I'm lost. And you might feel a little bit like that when we read the passage that we just heard. This is medieval poetry 1,500 years before Shakespeare, and I find it somewhat amusing that after my track record at school that I'm going to be speaking about this passage this morning. It's a passage where the church is a bride and is a city, when there's all sorts of jewels in her, when it's towering above the clouds. But I believe this passage tells us some wonderful things about the church as she will one day be. So let's step through it. Verse 9, this is the start of John's vision. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. So the first thing says we're talking about the churches. We've seen throughout this series the bride is a description of the church in the New Testament. But in this vision, when John's told, come, I will show you the bride becomes a city. Verse 11, in the city, it shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. This city is beautiful. She's brilliant. She's precious. It's like that moment when you sometimes catch a stone on a ring, or you see a jewel on a necklace, or you see something in nature that takes your breath away. And John sees this city. He's like, wow, the church as she one day will be is beautiful. She's precious. She takes his breath away. The church is also complete. Verse 12, on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So the 12 tribes of Israel represent the people of God before Jesus was born. The 12 apostles represent the people of God after Jesus was born. This is the ultimate fulfillment of everything that God has been doing. All his people from time and eternity through to now are gathered together in this city. God's plan has been fulfilled, and the city is not small either. The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured it with a rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length, as wide and high as it is long. How long is a stadia, I hear you ask? Well, 12,000 stadia is about 1,400 miles. So this city is bigger than Australia, but slightly smaller than India. But she towers as well, 1,400 miles up into the sky. That's beyond the clouds, beyond the International Space Station, up to somewhere in the exosphere. I don't know where. Should have listened more in geography, shouldn't I? And I would have known. But the point is, for someone listening to these words as they were written in 80 or 90 AD, she is bigger than anything that anyone can imagine, much greater or further than anywhere that anyone has ever traveled. This is the church as she will one day be. And she's not the same. You might have heard those list of list of stones that I struggle to read, but jasper, sapphire, emerald. This is a multifaceted, diverse, beautiful city. It's one of the things I love about the church now, actually, that she is one of the most diverse movements in history. The church meets in cellars and meets in stadiums. We sing psalms and symphonies. There's guitars, there's grime music, there's 19-year-olds, there's 90-year-olds. You might think of the average church being a white American man, but actually, if you look at Christian today, it's more likely to be a woman from sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. By the end of the century, it's very likely there'll be more Christians in China than there will be in America. This is the most diverse movement in history, and yet this is just a taste of what John sees when people from every tribe and tongue come together to worship Jesus. Finally, John says, whilst her gates remain open, she'll be incorruptible. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it, and nothing impure will ever enter it. The vision continues briefly in chapter 22. There's a river that runs down this city and trees that grow around her whose leaves are for the healing of the nations, but that's it. That's then the end of the Bible. John wraps it up. He says, come, Lord Jesus, come and do all of these things that I have seen. Come and do them amongst us. And then 4,000 years of Bible history ends with this wonderful vision of the church as she will be. And you notice as John was going through it, he was almost struggling to describe what he's seen. He talks about things being like gold, but as pure as glass or crystal. These things that in themselves don't make sense, but you can sense him trying to describe this wonderful thing that he's seen. The Apostle Paul, an early Christian leader, writes something similar to the church in Corinth. He says, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has ever conceived are the things that God has prepared for those who love him. Paul says that being part of the church, as she will one day be, is a future that is far greater than you dare imagine, far greater than you can possibly conceive. That's the end of the story. That's where all of this is heading. That's where we will one day be. At the same time, I know life can sometimes kick in. And that wonderful future can seem a little bit dim compared to the immediacy of all these things that are around us. And you, maybe like me, can find myself thinking, oh, church, why should I bother? There are so many other things that I could be doing. But I think if John's vision is true, and I believe that it is, if these words are something that we want to trust in, then surely that makes why should I bother become how could I not? How could I settle for anything less than this wonderful place that God has planned for us? How could I choose to be part of anything that isn't the church, that isn't what Jesus is doing amongst us? I don't know about you, but it makes me pray, Jesus, make me part of your church. Keep me in her. Don't let me wander away. Don't let me drift away. Don't let me get 10, 20 years down the line and not be part of her. Jesus says, doesn't he, that you can gain the whole world and forfeit your soul. When I hear this vision of the future, I think, Jesus, let that not be me. Keep me in your church. Of course, the church today is a very long way from the church as she will be. So I want to spend, I guess, the second part of this morning describing how we maybe live in that tension. I want to share a couple of stories from Christians that have gone before us. The first thing I want to encourage you with is to see the church as Jesus sees her. I think we need to let the words of God, even the words that we've read this morning, do their job to shape our minds, to shape the way that we think. The author C.S. Lewis wrote a famous book called The Screwtape Letters. Some of you will have read it. It's a series of letters between two demons, Uncle Screwtape and his nephew Wormwood. And Wormwood is trying to stop a patient becoming a Christian. It's a man. And Screwtape is writing to him to help him in his endeavors to stop this man following Jesus. And partway through the book, Screwtape writes this. He says, I note with grave displeasure that your patient has become a Christian. There's no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn into the enemy's camp and are now with us. One of our great allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her, spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes even our boldest tempters feel uneasy. But fortunately, it's quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is a half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer with an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy that neither of them understands, and another book containing corrupt religious lyrics, mostly bad, and in very small print. When he gets to his pew, he looks around and he sees that selection of neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. You want to lean pretty heavily on those neighbors. Make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax, which is certainly coming to the patient in his first few weeks as a churchman. Being part of the church doesn't always live up to expectations, and in light of these words, maybe you just want to take a look around you and see. No, I'm kidding. Kind of. Friends, the reason I know this to be true is because I am part of the church, and I have no doubt that some of you will find me quite frustrating. I'm sure that I will let people down. I think you probably will. We will hurt, and we will frustrate each other, and so we can be tempted to think, maybe it's not worth it. Why should I bother with that? Maybe if the church was like it was in the first century, then I could be a part of it, but not the church today, certainly not this church. But it's worth thinking about the church in the first century. The church in Corinth, for example, when its members were suing each other, when they were allowing incest, when the rich were stopping the poor from having communion. And Jesus didn't just let that happen. The leaders of that church they were written to and they were told to change it, but ultimately, that church transformed the world in the first century. And here's the punchline. Here's something I want to encourage you to think about. What if the things that annoy us about the church should actually be the things that amaze us about the church? What I mean is this. What if it is that God has not gathered together superstars, and it's that he's not gathered together those who have it all together, but it is precisely for fallen and faltering people that Jesus gave his life, that he loved them so much that he sacrificed everything for them. And it's precisely those same people through which Jesus wants to change the world. I want to encourage you this morning to see the church, to see the people of God as Jesus sees her. I know many of you do this really well already. I know it because when I'm at my worst, I speak to some of you and I don't feel judged and I feel encouraged and I feel wonderfully lucky to be part of this church. But I want to encourage you, though, to see the people of God as precious, perfect, being made perfect, loved. And there's nothing easier than to point out the faults, to find the flaws. Trust me, I sit in the leadership meetings. I know that we have them. But Jesus doesn't call us to point those things out. We all too well know where they are. He calls us to a higher way. He says, don't judge. Pull the plank out of your eye so that you can see clearly. See each other as brothers and sisters, loved and precious to God, who he gave his life for, and through whom he wants to transform lives and build community. Second thing I want to encourage you in is not just to see the church that Jesus sees, but to be the church that Jesus wants us to be. Because it's true that the church does need to change. We need to be more and more like that bridal city that we spoke about this morning. Again, I know many of you do this well. You are committed. You are part of this church. I know because you're here at 8 o'clock and you're here when I leave at 1 and I hear the stories of what's going on in the week and I hear from my children what those out in kids' work are doing. But I want to encourage you in your service. One of the most famous books written about the church was written by this man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was born in Germany, or what was Germany at the time. He was a theology student. He became a doctor when he was 21. He studied in Germany and in the UK and the US, and he was one of the first people that spoke out against Nazism in the 1930s. In fact, just a couple of days after Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer gave a famous speech speaking against him. But his experience of the church in the 30s was tough because more and more the church in Germany kind of assimilated and started doing the things that the Nazis were asking them to do. And Bonhoeffer eventually left, and just before the start of the Second World War, he found himself in America. But he felt God was telling him that it was a mistake, and he needed to go back to Germany. And so he did. He returned, and he was part of the church. He committed to her. He committed to see her change. He committed to be part of the change that he wanted to see, that he believed Jesus was calling them to be. Eventually, Bonhoeffer lost his life. He was executed just a couple of weeks before the end of the Second World War, but he was a man who saw not the church as she was, selling out, teaching falsely, spying on each other, but as she was meant to be, and he committed to being part of the change that he wanted to see. His last words were, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." He recognized that this was the end of his short time on earth, but his life in that wonderful bridal city was just about to start. He'd run the race, he'd walked the walk, he hadn't wavered, he'd stayed true, he'd stayed part of Jesus' church. As I say, I know many of you do this so well. You have committed. I can see a few here that have a few years on me, and it is so good and so encouraging to see you here. I know some of you work really hard, and often when it's difficult to do it, I want to say thank you, I want to say well done. And I want to encourage you with these words written by the early church leader, Paul. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." Paul tells us that our work for Jesus is never without purpose, because we know where it's heading. We know what all of this is heading towards. It's that city. It's that wonderful future. Every step we take is one step towards the future. It's been said many times, hasn't it, that if you're a follower of Jesus, you don't kind of get a choice about whether to be part of the church. You are in the church. It's a bit like my son. By the very fact that he's my son, he's in my family. If you're a Christian, you are part of the church. And the only choice that my son faces and all of us face is what kind of member we want to be. I want to encourage you to be active, to be praying, to be challenging, to be changing, to be caring, to be looking out for those around you, to be committed to the family of God. It's so great to have you here. I want to say one more thing before I finish, and this one's a little bit more personal. We've spoken about seeing the church that Jesus sees. We spoke about being the church that Jesus wants us to be. Why do I bother with church? For me, it's because I need the church. I need each of you. I need to gather with Christians each week. I found COVID a really difficult time not being able to gather with the church. And at first it didn't feel that different. It maybe felt like I just set out on a slightly different path where a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks down the line, nothing had really changed. But 6 months later, or a year later, or 2 years later, or maybe 10 years if we hadn't been able to gather, I was in a vastly different place from where I wanted to be. I think Jesus knew this. The church isn't our clever idea. Jesus founded the church. He knew that we needed each other. Just before he died, didn't he? He said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against her." Jesus' first followers, right from the very beginning, gathered together to sing and to pray and to care and to learn. And then in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, we read this: "Let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." I want to ask you gently this morning whether you might have a habit or formed a habit of not meeting together. One of the clearest instructions in the New Testament is for Christians to be gathering together week after week after week, to spend time with each other, to spend time with God. Why? Well, I, for one, I know I just need it. I need it for a bunch of reasons. I need it so I can stay focused on the things that matter. These are the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel. He writes this famous book about the Sabbath, and he says, 6 days a week we wrestle with the world, wringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in the soul. When I look back on my work week this week, I've worked a job, I've got some quotes for a building extension, I haven't moved a tree, I've paid someone else to move a tree. I've done performance appraisals, I've met new clients, and with all of these things going on, and you will have a long list, I'm sure yourself, as we're wrestling with the world, as the rabbi says, there's all sorts of things that can become our focus. I need time every week to care for the seed of eternity that's planted in my soul. I need time to focus on Jesus, to confess sin, to know forgiveness, to know love and care from those around me. I need the church as well to help me keep my thoughts aligned to the words of the Bible. Spend a few nights watching Question Time or Newsnight or reading magazines, books, all great things to do. But there are so many different thoughts, so many different value systems that are fighting for my heart and for my mind. And I want to be one that follows the words of Jesus. They're not always super popular. And they were said 2,000 years ago. I'm not going to hear about them on the screen, but this is a man who said he was the Son of God. Who said that he would prove it by rising from the dead, and who did just that. So I want to trust in his words, but I need to be in community. I need help to do that, because otherwise it's an incredibly lonely journey. The Apostle Paul says, doesn't he, that to the church were given apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, building up the body of Christ. Why? So that we may no longer be infants, tossed about by the waves and carried around by every wave of teaching. I need the church to help me stay the course. There's more that could be said, but we're short on time, so we're going to come into land. This passage in Revelation ends with this. It says, "Nothing impure will ever enter it," that's this city, "nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life." You might find that a difficult verse to read. I know that I do. I think, gosh, I've done things that are impure. I've done things that are shameful. I've done things that are deceitful. But I want you to know this morning that those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life are not a who's who of all who've kept it together, a who's who of those who succeeded, but those who recognized that they needed Jesus. Whether rich or poor, old or young, success or failure, those who came before Jesus on level ground and said, "Jesus, I need you. I need your mercy. I need your grace. I know that on my own, I cannot be part of this wonderful future that you have." Who've accepted the gift, accepted the offer that Jesus gave us when he died on the cross. If that's new for you this morning, if you're not a follower of Jesus and you would like to talk a little bit more about what that may be, I would love to chat with you after the service. I'd with anyone in a yellow t-shirt or sitting here at the front, or we can talk during the week as well. Friends, the church as she is going to be the most wonderful place. So precious. She's on a journey. It's a slow one. I'm sure it's a frustrating one at times, but it's a journey that started with just 12 people in a room and is now spread to every corner of the earth. It's also true that the church hasn't always got it right, but she has done many things right. Hundreds of millions of lives has been transformed. She's founded hospitals, schools, universities. She's stood against slavery and racism and war. She's fed the poor. She's visited the prisoner. She's found homes for the orphan and the widow. And maybe most of all, she's given each one of us and anyone who ever came into contact with her the opportunity to know Jesus Christ, to be in relationship, to know peace with God, to be part of that wonderful city that we heard described this morning, to have a wonderful hope, a wonderful future. And I know we're not there yet. Please join us, though, as we try to see the church as Jesus sees her, try and be the church that Jesus wants us to be. Let's not be those who criticize. Let's be those who build up, who encourage one another, who see the good, who sees what Jesus sees in each other. And let's be those like Jesus, who so loved the church that he gave his life for her. Can I hand over Rachel and the band to lead us in a time of song worship?
You're like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound. And when I fall, you've tied a rope to me. You're blessing me every day.